to warn our speakers is, since we do webcasts, we do have some students and other people who watch on the web. And if they email in questions, they do it to an email address. So that's why I'm checking my phone.
Okay.
Is to monitor those. Students they have to check in the beginning.
Right.
I just like to tell people I'm not being rude.
Right. Yeah.
Welcome everyone to the Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a faculty member here at PSU's School of Urban Studies and Planning, and also director of OTREC. And along with my colleague, Professor Miguel Figliozzi in Civil and Environmental Engineering, we help co-organize this weekly seminar. For those of you who may be new, I want to let everyone and remind everyone else that we do webcast the seminars, so there are people out there watching us on the web. So when we get to the point where you are asking questions, you need to be using the microphones. There should be one on each desk. Hold the touch button, keep the red light lit while you're asking your questions so people on the web, both live and into the future, can hear your question. If for some reason it's not working or it's absent, I or Miguel will come around with the portable mic. So with that out of the way, I want to introduce our speaker for the day. We're very happy today to have Kevin Downing here. He is the Clean Diesel Program Coordinator for the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. This program addresses the concerns of diesel pollution through a progressive, non-regulatory approach focused on accelerating the benefits of clean diesel strategy, including financial assistance in the form of federal grants. Kevin has developed a breakthrough project securing approval of all major Portland area hospitals to implement clean diesel zones at their facilities. He has represented the state of Oregon on multi-state task forces devoted to reducing clean diesel emissions and global warming contributors. Previously, he served on the board of directors for Cascade Sierra Solutions as an airshed planner for DEQ. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Kevin. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. So I thought I bore myself occasionally when I give these presentations, so I thought I'd try a new wrinkle, and which is why I titled it Driving to the Tragedy of Commons with a Diesel Engine, more or less. So we'll see if I can follow through on the conceit or not, but generally we'll talk about diesel engines and the role that they play here. Let me do this. There we go. So the Tragedy of the Commons actually was an article that was written by Garrett Hardin back in 1968, and really kind of pointed out sort of the one overarching construct to explain sort of the environmental paradigm. That is that we have these issues that result in an environmental impact and the difficulty in resolving those. And his analogy was talking about actually sort of a field, a common grazing area where shepherds or farmers could bring cattle, and there was so much carrying capacity within the commons to support the cattle. But the dynamic is that a rational person could say that if I added one more cow, if I added one more cow of my own to the commons, I would get greater benefit to that from that addition of that cow than then would the penalty come from me from the damaging the commons over time. And Mr. Hardin's essay was fairly pessimistic that way, and felt that actually that there was virtually inevitable that the commons would always be damaged in this kind of a scenario where there was a common, as Aristotle put it, what is common to the greatest number has the least care bestowed upon it. And so there are examples of that, and actually there's the other examples that people got more hopeful and optimistic about managing the commons. But let me sort of work through on this within this context, and I think that actually diesel engines themselves, or the emissions from diesel engines, represent to a certain extent an instance of the commons as well. And so other examples of the commons have been sort of how we deal with waste in terms of trash and garbage, but also other examples of overfishing, or use of fossil fuels, or even actually the highway system, the capacity of the highway system, that the more that's provided in common, the more people consume it, and they get that individual benefit while consuming that, that resource in common. So with diesels, of course, they're all over the place. Diesels move about 80% of the freight that's moved in this country, and historically has been a dominant power plant within that sector, and it's because of their power, their durability, their reliability, and the economy of the diesel engine. And as well, there's actually even an environmental advantage to using diesels because they are, in fact, at this point, the most efficient combustion engine out there. They use less fuel per unit of work completed, and even from an environmental sense, actually they're the engine that should be used for if our concern is the most efficient use of the fossil fuel resources that we have available. But there's also the other aspect of diesel, which is that pollution that comes out of the tailpipe, which is their historic nemesis, actually, is that what actually Ford and GM talk about as the social incompatibility of diesel engines, which is that smoke and odor that typically associated with diesel engines that prevents them from being more widely used, especially in this country. This is actually a fairly extreme example. What we're looking at here is it's just actually a lot of particulate emissions from the engine, which actually reflects incomplete combustion, which actually, no, diesels are not historically like this, but some are deliberately made to run this way. So the diesel exhaust itself is a complex mixture of gases and particles, and are among all the range of pollutants that engines emit, diesels themselves are historically outsized contributors to particulate matter and nitrogen oxide emissions. So for instance, of all the motor vehicles that are registered in Oregon, about 6% of them are diesels, that is mostly on the heavy duty side now. But they emit about 70% of the particulate and about 35% of the NOx from all motor vehicles. So they're really big contributors for those types of pollutants. And what my concern really is about here is about the particulate side. I could actually include a whole raft of slides about health effects, but there's health effects associated with particulate emissions and diesels in particular that range from impacts on the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system, and now actually some recent work on cognition. That the particles are so small that they evade the body's defenses, as we heard last week a little bit, I think, too, and penetrate deep into the lungs. And not only that, they're so small that they act, although they're a solid, they act like an aerosol, so they're actually able to transfer through the lung into the bloodstream. And because of the sticky nature of the carbon phase that is a large component of diesel exhaust, they're able also to adsorb other chemicals, other toxics, and bring those deep into the body, into the somatic cells in the body, leading to increased risk for cancer and heart disease and other health effects like that. So we've done some work here in Portland that is actually fairly unique. You heard about the MATES study last week in Southern California. This is actually the PATS, I guess it's PATS, there's no E in it, the PATS study here in Portland, where we were looking at, based on the success that we've had in terms of controlling the so-called criteria pollutants under the Clean Air Act, is there still some residual risk from remaining toxics that are in the air in the Portland area, when we identified actually about 19 pollutants above, at concentrations above levels that exceed Oregon benchmarks for safe exposure, which is generally, for most of the pollutants, it's a cancer factor, and generally we're looking at reducing the risk below 1 in a million. So this is actually a map that you can see of the Portland area. This is actually in 2017, so current conditions are actually worse than this. So this is projecting out to 2017, suggesting that with the implementation of federal emission standards and other changes in the fleet and whatnot, we're still going to see risk levels for most of the major area here above, for the major population centers here, above 10 in a million. And to put it in context, too, last week, Peter Greenwald from South Coast Air Quality Management District talked about the risk factor for cancer that's used in the state of California. The risk factor we've used here for cancer in Oregon is actually less protective. It's actually 33 times, the standard is 33 times less protective of public health. So actually, if we were using the California values, these risk values would be actually higher than what we're seeing here on the map. But nonetheless, this is what we've determined based on our adoption of a benchmark for exposure to diesel particulates. So we're seeing actually a fairly substantial and widespread problem. And there's another impact I actually want to talk about from diesels as well, and that's actually its influence on climate change. Now, as I said earlier, diesels are a very efficient power plant. And so based on the amount of work that they do, the amount of CO2 that's emitted per unit of work completed by a diesel engine is much lower than for gasoline engines. And so therefore, actually, we should be moving more towards a diesel platform in our cars, for instance, if that was the driving factor. Except for that, there's that black carbon piece, that soot element out of diesel, which you can see in this scenario here that it's listed here as being the second largest anthropogenic influence on climate change next to CO2. And I just want to make clear that black carbon is not only from diesel, but also from burning coal, burning wood, and other sources like the other sort of carbon-based combustion processes. So actually the third world, in the developing world, actually the largest source is actually from biomass burning, from cook stoves and things like that. But actually diesels in the developed world, in North America in particular, are the largest source of black carbon, even compared to that from coal-burning power plants. And the attractiveness about reducing black carbon is not only is it significant, but it's actually very potent. It has an impact of estimated about 2,000 times that on an equivalent mass basis that of carbon dioxide. It's also attractive in terms of its residence time in the atmosphere, and we'll talk about that shortly here, that it's actually a fairly short residence time as compared to carbon dioxide. And recently, this is actually one of the most recent studies that was published. This is actually done by workers, I think, affiliated with the United Nations, and they're suggesting actually working on what they call, what's now called short-lived climate forcing agents. So that includes methane and tropospheric ozone as well, as a means of moving forward on the climate change issue while we're still stuck, as it were, because of the huge inertia in terms of moving forward on carbon dioxide reductions. And what they're suggesting is that if we were to, for instance, if we look at this top line here, this is what they're suggesting is business as usual will be above 2 degrees C in, what is that, about 2030, and increase from current conditions. If we were to look at just methane and black carbon measures, we could see that we could bend that curve down. But actually combining the CO2, which is actually important, this is not just an either or, but it's a parallel strategy. If we combine the CO2, methane, and black carbon, we actually stand a very reasonably good chance of actually seeing only a modest increase in the ambient temperature increases as a result of the climate change influence agents. So it's something that we're recognizing. And actually, it was just last week even that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton announced a multinational effort to work collaboratively to reduce black carbon and methane emissions around the world, which would actually have impacts on, say, how rice paddies are managed in terms of minimizing the methane emissions from cultivation of rice, and other factors like that. So it really becomes kind of an opportunity for technology transfer between the first world and the third world, and still making significant advances on these kinds of short-lived pollutants. So the good news is that diesel engines in this country are getting cleaner. This is actually a graphic that shows the federal emission limits for NOx and PM for diesel engines. So this is for a new engine in 1988 had to fit within this box. And subsequent to that, EPA has adopted regulations that makes the diesel engines cleaner and cleaner. So until in 2010, what we have is an engine has to fit within this box in order to be sold in this country. This is a tremendous accomplishment. It actually represents the cleanest diesel engines in the world now being sold in this country. And that would be great, and I wouldn't be up here talking about all this except for the fact that these guys hang around for a long time. The projected benefit from this, EPA says, will probably be realized somewhere after 2030. That based on the turnover of the engines alone, that we'll see that the lag time towards that accumulated benefit is that about 20 years out, or about half of a bureaucrat's lifetime, is what I suggest. And that would be okay if we were willing to wait, but we're taking an effort here in the state that we want to begin to address those so-called legacy vehicles by bringing cleaner technology into the fleet sooner rather than later. And there's really basically, I've broken it down into kind of 3 basic strategies, which is to burn a cleaner fuel, burn fuel cleaner, and burn less fuel. And all these are good ways to go. For instance, on a cleaner fuel, we can look at ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel, which is now actually becoming the standard for petroleum diesel. It's a lower sulfur content fuel, which actually does result in some emission reduction in and of itself, but its primary value is that it allows the use of advanced exhaust controls on diesel engines. So the 2007 and 2010 trucks could not have met that standard without a cleaner fuel in place, because the sulfur that's a contaminant in diesel fuel is not added to the fuel, it's just there and would otherwise cost money to take it out, is a poison for the precious metals that are typically used in catalytic converters. So taking it out allows us to put catalytic converters or something like them on heavy-duty diesel trucks. And of course, there's other fuel strategies, of course, that you're aware of. There's biodiesel, natural gas, propane, and even now electric trucks. You can see my little bad picture here of the Staples truck here that actually operates in the Portland downtown core now, along with some Frito-Lay trucks. You may have seen them running around as well now, too. Those are all great strategies for reducing emissions from otherwise what would have been a diesel engine. The other strategy, actually burning the fuel cleaner, I'm going to highlight here, is actually what's, I like to describe it as engine upgrading, but even I fall into talking about it as retrofitting, which is basically putting advanced exhaust controls on the tailpipe of existing engines. And the technologies that are available there are fairly astonishing. So what we're talking about here is something like a catalytic converter that you have on your car, except that every other channel in this device is plugged so that the exhaust gases have to move through and get filtered through. That's what provides the filtering action for the particulate matter. It's capable of reducing particulate emissions from a diesel engine by upwards of 95%, reducing the hydrocarbon and CO emissions similarly to comparable levels as well, and has the net effect of being actually as clean or cleaner than a comparable natural gas-powered vehicle. That's how far the technology has come for clean diesel engines. And that's what's actually being installed on the new equipment that's being sold now. And so what we're looking at is an effort to actually identify those vehicles that where we can to bring those forward onto existing vehicles to have them in place to bring those benefits sooner rather than later. And to give you an idea, too, about what this might look like, let's see if I can get this to fly here. Come on, where are you going? What we're seeing here is a PM monitor in a car that's chasing these trucks. And the one on the left is a regular garbage truck, standard practice. You can see that the purple line is much higher there. And on the one on the right is actually a truck fitted with a diesel particle filter. What's interesting about this one, too, is it just started off from acceleration. You would expect to see a spike in particulates as that truck accelerated off, but there's nothing there that tells you that actually occurred, so that the emissions actually in a trailing vehicle are much, much lower than in following a retrofitted truck than in a conventional truck. This is actually a pretty astonishing advance in technology, as I said. I was going to ask last week, but I surmised that actually a truck fitted with this technology that operates in the Los Angeles basin, where there's high levels of PM and NOx emissions, that the emissions coming out of the tailpipe are going to be cleaner than the air that went into the truck. So we've also looked at burning less fuel as a strategy as well. So we've been looking at techniques to improve the fuel efficiency of over-the-road trucks, which are already relatively fuel efficient relative to your car. Even though it's 6 miles per gallon, it doesn't sound very good, but they're pulling 80,000 pounds, which I factored on that basis actually means that they're actually performing at a higher level than you are in your Prius car, for instance. But there's still an enormous opportunity there to improve the efficiency of that truck. And Dr. Figliosi was working with us on a committee where we looked at that, made some recommendations to the legislature. And I had to look back. I was looking at our analysis that we did, these trailer skirts, for instance. You know, if we factored in the cost of purchasing the trailer skirts and putting them on the truck, and the cost of a loan to actually to get to the capital to install those trailer skirts on the truck. And initially when I ran the numbers, I said, well, we'll look at $2.50, $3, and $3.50 a gallon, thinking that $3.50 was pretty outrageous, and we'll never get there, really. And so at $3.50 a gallon, these trucks would return $2,000 a year. That's actually even after paying off the loan payments on the note to put these skirts on 3 trailers per tractor. he'd be putting $2,000 in his pocket right from the start and still have money to pay off the loan, make the loan payments. And so it's interesting, actually as a real-world observation, that the response from the trucking industry was that, well, one is that fuel costs are one of the highest costs that they carry, that we care very much about managing our costs, and we work on tight margins, and we would put these things on if it made sense for us, and so you don't have to require it. And so actually, you should go out now and start taking a look at the trucks you see on the street and see how many of them now at fuel prices closer to $4 a gallon, how many of them actually carry this type of improvements on their trucks. But nonetheless, we still kind of look to pursue that. Reducing idling is another instance here, and I have a locomotive here instead of a truck. We've actually worked on truck stop electrification, but the locomotive is kind of is an instance of which you may not be ordinarily aware. Because of the design of locomotives, they tend to run all the time. And particularly for switch engines in rail yards, they may burn something like 15,000 gallons of fuel a year just idling. And that can be fixed actually by putting on smaller engines that provide that meet the housekeeping needs for which otherwise the main engine is run at much less cost. And we were successful in getting some of that work installed on some Burlington Northern equipment that's actually housed in the Clark County Yard over in Vancouver, and actually then some here in the Gould's Lake Yard here in Portland as well. And then the other strategy is actually upgrading the engines to reduce fuel consumption, and this we've been doing a lot of work on with marine engines here along the Columbia River, where on one instance we upgraded engines that were otherwise 40 years old, put new engines in, and because of the advances in technology, the engines have gotten much more fuel efficient over time, where we're able to save that one company 4,000 gallons of fuel per trip back and forth up and down the river with this advance in technology. Of course, we also got tremendous emission reductions, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So what I wanted to do is actually with this just kind of show you from a cost effectiveness perspective, given that we have tight budgets all the way around, what is the most cost effective strategy for reducing emissions from a diesel engine. And it kind of goes back to the tragedy of the commons piece here, which is the reason why we've not been more wildly successful on this, is because of that the breakdown in terms of what it costs to get the most effective technology, and that breakdown in who pays and who benefits from that sort of investment. So the first bar here was actually, if we were to install a diesel particle filter on a truck, how much emission reductions do we get per dollar spent? And you can see just graphically, compared to some of the others, these two are fuel strategies with changes in the way the diesel itself is formulated. This is propane. This is another diesel fuel strategy. This is biodiesel, which is actually a great fuel, but from an air quality perspective, it's actually a fairly expensive strategy. Recognize that there are other multiple benefits for using biodiesel, but air quality is not its greatest strength. Even looking at investing in a diesel hybrid or natural gas or other vehicles like that, you can see that the cost effectiveness of putting a particle filter on a truck is very, very high. And so given all the other things that are going on in the world, and diesel engines provide great value, as it were, and so is this a problem worth solving? And so I wanted to sort of lay some context for that. So the top number, $183 billion a year, is actually what the Diesel Technology Forum estimated to be the direct value provided by diesel engines to the American economy. This is actually a trade group that promotes diesel engines, clean diesel in particular too as well, but also trying to make sure the diesel still retains a place. And based on EPA's estimates of the health impacts associated with diesel, we're looking at, they're estimating about $175 billion a year cost to Americans from the exposure to diesel exhaust. So while there's a marginal benefit difference for having diesels around, the impact costs are really, really very high, which suggests that there's actually a tremendous opportunity for us to gain some of that savings back by reducing the emissions from diesel engines. So it's actually a fairly significant problem. And to give you an idea, we haven't run the numbers particularly for Oregon per se, but, excuse me, in Oregon, we have about 1% of the national population, but we consume about 1.5% of the diesel fuel in the country. So generally, you might look at, say, about 1.5% of 175 billion represents the annual impact in Oregon, which is a fairly sizable chunk of change. Now, the issue is that when I go to talk to somebody about trying to put a filter on their vehicle, they get what the issue is. They get what the problem is. Actually telling people that diesel engines are dirty is the easiest thing I have to say. Getting them to see that actually spending money like $9,000 to put a filter on one of these engines is actually really hard because of the breakdown in the economics. The filter provides tremendous benefit to the community, but it provides very little direct benefit to the operator. So again, we're looking at the tragedy of the commons here in the reverse, so that he has to incur all those costs to provide the benefit to the community, and from a strict business perspective, he sees very little gain in it. But look at it from a larger perspective, from a social perspective, this excavator operating at 1,500 hours a year might have a downstream impact upwards of $52,000. So if we look at that from a return on investment perspective, the break-even point is about 3 months into it, which from a business case perspective is hugely positive. And in any kind of normal standard business operation would be the kind of investment any reasonable manager would say, get it done tomorrow. So in another way of looking at it is in terms of, I've been looking at this too in terms of the strategy that we are employing here is actually relying actually no longer on state grants, but on federal grants. So given that the federal grants come from tax dollars, and is this a decent use of public expenditures? Do we get much of a return for this kind of expenditure? So again, here's a marine repower project. This is the Catherine B. This is actually a very interesting project because this is a boat that's it's a family-owned business. They've been operating on the river for over 100 years. We've changed out the engines in this boat. We eliminated 2.4 tons of particulate matter per year, about 328 metric tons of CO2. And that's from the fuel savings that we were able to get. And then in addition, we were able to calculate about 1,210 tons of black carbon equivalent, or CO2 equivalent black carbon, for this project as well. So then if we look at, so EPA, when they develop their rulemakings for various strategies, they assign a cost-benefit analysis to this. And so based on that assumption, we look at costs somewhere between $300,000 to $800,000 per ton of PM reduced from marine engines is the value of that work. So then we plug that into this, and we put about $400,000 into the project. So that value that we return is somewhere between $800,000 and $1.9 million a year, which means that the break-even on this project was somewhere between 2 and 6 months. And that if we look at it from a financial perspective, I like running with these numbers because it kind of helps put it in context for me anyway. So if we look at the return on investment from that public, at the 5th year, we're looking at an annual percentage yield of between 200% and 500%, which is a lot better than putting your money in the stock market. So I think that actually what we're looking at here is actually a very wise investment of public funding because the returns here are so high. Okay, so you don't have to believe me. So listen to this guy, though. This is actually Dr. John Graham. He actually taught at Harvard for years. He ran the Center for Public Policy at Harvard and was appointed by President George Bush to a position in the administration that caused some consternation. One of his primary work of practice at the Center for Public Policy was evaluating the cost effectiveness of government regulations. And he generally came down on the side of that most regulations written by federal agencies were not cost effective. They were misdirected. They didn't deliver value for what they were intending to do. And you can see some of the comments that people made about his appointment. In fact, his appointment to the Office of Management and Budget generated the 2nd largest volume of opposition next to that of John Ashcroft in the administration. But you can see he's a Pluto's dream come true. And even then, shortly into his post, he got the prize for the Clean Air Villain of the Month. So anyway, actually one of the first things that he did in his office was actually to defend the Clinton administration EPA's adoption of the 2007 truck standards. So the American Trucking Association fought hard to prevent that from actually coming into place. But he defended that. He also inserted his office into the rulemaking that EPA did on the subsequent adoption of the non-road emission standards for diesel. And then his office then did an evaluation of a variety of federal rules and said this rule in particular, the EPA non-road diesel rule, was actually one of the most cost-effective federal regulations ever written. So that's kind of so we're looking at something here that's incredibly wise expenditure of public funds, which actually the driver then for the public funds in this is the fact is that there's this breakdown especially on the retrofit side, for people to actually take this on internally within their business operations so that the fleet manager can then justify to his boss to actually be spending this kind of money. And that's typically very difficult. And even on the towboat project, for instance, where we're able to show them a rate of return back that our money's actually making this project possible, where it would have just languished on for longer yet again. So I forgot to tell you, there was one example. It was actually only a couple of years ago. There was a tug in the Portland Harbor that was powered by engines from a World War II submarine. Another example of how long these engines last. The financial dynamic even they face, even though we're looking at substantial fuel savings there, is that on a 5 to 6 year cycle, they look at rebuilding their engines, which maybe normally on a towboat might cost them something like $200,000 to do that, which is more or less tearing the engine down, taking out the wear parts, replacing them, put it all back in, and the engine goes back into service, but is built to the same standards, emission standards of which it was originally commissioned probably 30 or 40 years ago, as opposed to getting these new engines in, which might cost them upwards of $2 million. So by our showing up and offering somewhere between $400,000, maybe $500,000 at the top, we are able to actually energize this kind of transaction to make it happen on the river. And actually I'll get to that in a second here. So what we've been able to do over several years' time here is a number of projects with school districts all over the state, retrofitting school buses, putting exhaust controls on the engine and on the tailpipe. We've also been working with trucking companies here and there, as well as the truck stop projects, where we were one of the first states to have multimodal, like 2 different systems actually out there for truckers to plug in, so that during their federally required rest stops, they could actually have a more enjoyable, safer, and more restful night's sleep, rather than sitting there having their truck vibrate them to sleep all night long. We've been doing the towboat work, as I described, and actually it's been one sector that actually we've done quite a bit of work in, and I actually have to say that it's really, I think, made a significant difference along the Columbia. There's one national study that was done that calculated that the emissions per ton mile of particulate from inland towing was something like 0.01 grams per particulate per ton mile traveled. When we look at the work that we've done on the towboats, there's 10 boats that have been upgraded on the Columbia. And among those 10 boats, we've been able to drop that number down to 0.0001 grams per ton mile emitted. So now we can talk about the Columbia as actually running green instead of brown. We've also done some work in the construction sector, which actually remains a persistent and actually a high volume emitter. It's actually a significant portion of the total emission inventory in the Portland area in particular and in Oregon in general, as well as the locomotive work that we've talked about before. So this is the part where I get whether I'm glass half full or glass half empty in the kind of work that we do. We had projected, one of the things about diesel is that it's a legacy pollutant, as it were. So if we wait long enough, it'll actually fix itself over time, rather than being, say, an emerging problem like the introduction of flame retardants in clothing and upholstery, and what are we going to do about that, and the exposure to the toxic burdens that we might otherwise see from people introducing chemicals into the various products that we use. But this will fix itself. So that's so what we set ourselves a challenge that in 2017 we wanted to reduce the emissions down to that 1 in a million cancer risks that I talked about earlier, which would mean about 160 tons per year is what we need to get to achieve that goal. And with all of that work that we've done so far, we're probably at about maybe a total of about 80 to 90 tons max on that. That's just total, and not 160 tons per year since about 2007, which we sort of began this official work. So we're well behind where we ought to be in terms of getting that done. So that's the glass half empty side on this. But at the same time, though, occasionally I try to console myself with what I've done, and the value that I bring to Oregonians every year is somewhere between about $20 to $30 million a year, which I would suggest which makes me feel very comfortable cashing my paycheck every month, and would suggest that on a per dollar spent per value return that I'm actually doing tremendously well, except that I've got another $1 billion worth of value I need to secure somehow in this. One of the things actually I wanted to leave you with, so in terms of, a lot of environmental paradigms talk about whatever it is that it's on before you is fixing this will solve all kinds of, will be major reductions and all these kinds of, whatever the problem is that's being presented to you. And I don't want to leave you with that kind of impression. Actually, with diesel, there'll still be global warming. There'll still be cancer. There'll still be asthma risk. There'll still be other things that are associated with diesel exhaust exposure. But the attractive thing about working on diesels is on that one factor about cleaning up a diesel engine has multiple benefits over all these problems and others as well, and which actually provides fairly rewarding experience and justification for taking on this kind of work. So again, to kind of bring it back to the tragedy of the commons, part of the challenges here is that the benefits are dispersed and they're in the future, and generally people have a really hard time moving forward in that kind of a scenario. The solutions come at a cost. They're limited to, and the costs are limited to a few people. So the costs are not widespread, but they're tied to the fleet managers who themselves, as I said earlier, don't see much direct benefit from these upgrades. And that it's a legacy problem. So it's very hard with fleet managers to actually talk with them about doing something to their existing vehicles. They're always kind of oriented toward, even though that is the most cost-effective thing that we could be doing, they tend to be more oriented towards buying something new, bright, and shiny, rather than dealing with something that's old and crusty and sitting on their lot. And there's also, frankly, the challenge between being voluntary and regulatory. We've been implementing this program on a non-regulatory basis. I hate using the word voluntary, all these things. So, because it always implies, to a certain extent, not important. And the impression I'd like to convey is that this is voluntary in the sense is not what you get to do, but not whether you get to do something, but what you will do. So your choice is actually to step up and do something about clean diesel, but not whether or not you're going to do something about that. So I would like to point out that hopefully you understand that we're addressing a serious need, that solutions are readily available, and well, it will require substantial effort to make that happen. It was something on a back of the envelope calculation, it would probably take about $700 million in total for us to clean up all the diesel engines that operate in Oregon. But again, if you're looking at, say, a $2 billion a year impact associated with diesels, I don't really have a hard time asking for $700 million. These strategies we're looking at are cost effective. They deliver tremendous value back to the public health and the environment and bringing substantial gains. So with that, I'll open myself to any questions, and thank you for paying attention. Sure, go ahead.
I was wondering, in one of the first slides that you had, you said that diesel contributes something like 60% of the particulate matter and I was wondering if that calculation is by mass, or if there is any account for the fact that fine particulates are a bigger concern, or becoming a bigger concern right now.
Well, actually, this is looking at PM 2.5. It is calculated by mass, which is how we, as opposed to number, which is the other way. So yeah, so it's actually of the share from motor vehicles is what I meant to be clear about. Because actually, in terms of total PM that's out there, there's actually larger sources of PM, like combustion sources like fires, burning wood stoves, and things like that. But within the motor vehicle sector, they're very significant. And even within that total mass of PM that we're exposed to, diesel emissions are also highlighted as being especially of concern for health concerns outside of even the ambient collection of particulates. And you had a question?
Yeah, you said that that diesel is a legacy pollutant and that it will fix itself. Could you talk a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Sure. Well, it's that with the adoption of the federal engine certification standards for new engines, so they only apply to engines built after a certain date and going forward, so they're going to get cleaner and cleaner. So eventually, if we just wait long enough, people will get rid of the old engines and we'll see newer engines brought into the fleet. So as opposed to, say, a problem where we think that there's an increasing incidence of, I don't know, whatever, we're using more and more and I'm making this up at this point. So, so we're increasing use of electronics, and from that comes some chemical, say, that's used in the manufacture of electronics or plastic cases or whatnot, where we're increasing our exposure to more and more of this stuff. And it's And we don't really understand it yet, but say that there's a body burden associated with that. So and there's no clear fix at this point either. So that's the difference actually with the diesel, is that there is a fix in place and it's actually being implemented. And the question really for all of us is whether we're satisfied with the pace, or whether we're willing to wait it out, or whether we think that taking action sooner is important for us. I'll go with you. Sure. Go ahead.
Oh, you had mentioned a little bit about the fuel itself, and I'm wondering if there's a lot to be gained from further regulation of limits of the content of the fuel, or if the only point in that was to get the sulfur level low enough so that these emissions controls work, and then there's not much return on investment from further cleaning up the fuel that goes in.
So what happened in 2006 is that the federal regulations required the highway fuel to move from a sulfur content of about 500 parts per million sulfur down to 15 parts per million sulfur. That's the ultra low. And then subsequently, and the non-road fuel moved over to ultra low actually last summer. No, 2010. And then sometime here in the next year or so, the fuel for marine and locomotive engines will also drop down to that 15 ppm level. I haven't seen much discussion, among environmental professionals about further reductions in PM level in fuels. I don't recall, but I think that there might be lower sulfur content in Japan, for instance. And the primary reason for doing that, as I said, was that it would facilitate the introduction of devices that have precious metals in them. To a certain extent, we've also recently reduced the sulfur content in gasoline. And one of the reasons for doing that was, even though it's not very high, by reducing the sulfur content in gasoline to even lower levels, the catalytic converters that are now installed on our cars would have an extended longer life. So we get further reductions over a longer period of time than was originally projected. So that might be what might happen, but I have not seen any discussion yet any push for further reduction in the sulfur content of diesel, of petroleum diesel.
But I mean, does it have? Is the effect so small from further reducing it that it just doesn't make any more sense to approach it from that end as opposed to on the tailpipe end?
I suspect, we might very well be at the limits of what we can technologically achieve from the current design of diesel engines. There's other designs for diesel engines using different sorts of combustion processes that are on the drawing boards that actually could get them cleaner. But given the design of the current diesel engine, we may be about where we're at this point with those.
I'm just thinking about the potential possibly for trading emissions credits, and I know that is problematic with air quality because of the nature of it, but I'm wondering if you see any potential economies of scale that could bring down the price of the technology, like the filters, so that larger fleets, companies with larger fleets and larger amounts of capital could potentially sell those credits to smaller companies, or kind of compensate for the cost to those smaller companies with the economy of scale.
So let's see. Actually, I guess the short answer to your question is yes, there's a possibility. I don't know that there's an easy solution in that direction. And primarily because of the mobility of diesel engines, you'd have to have the trading occur on a broad scale in order for that to somehow make sense, because otherwise people would be able to move in and out of any given smaller geographic area, even one as large as a state. But potentially, if you were to assign the costs to operating a dirty diesel engine and then incorporate those costs into a program where you paid that money back out to those that still had some of the dirty engines, you could facilitate some of the cleanup that occurred. And that's kind of a model that they're actually using in Vancouver, BC, where they've rolled out a program, it's actually only just in the last year or so, where if you operate a non-road diesel engine in the greater Vancouver, BC regional area, then you pay on a per horsepower rate for the use of that engine. And that rate will actually increase over time so that it becomes more costly, thus serving as a very strong signal that you need to clean that engine up. Yes. Oh, go ahead.
I may have missed it, but Are there any subsidies at all with this when the companies do the retrofits, and if not, do you see any in the future being provided for this?
Sure. So that's basically what I've been doing, is actually using public money. Occasionally, very rarely am I able to convince people because of my good looks and charm to do this work on their own. So been relying primarily on federal money. There was a moment in time when I had state funds available for grants, and we actually had state tax credits as well. And that program went away here in December. And both of the state money disappeared because of the budget issues that we're facing. So there's the Diesel Emission Reduction Act, which is the primary vehicle for funding at the federal level. And we've been successful at getting a fairly reasonable share of that in Oregon for projects here. And then, frankly, we also look under other rocks and bushes, too. So, for instance, one of the programs we look at using is the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Program. That's actually it's federal highway dollars that we can divert towards diesel projects. And frankly, another project, I'm really hoping we can pull this one off. Actually, there's one where we're looking at rural electrification funding to remove diesel generators that that power housing facilities for ODOT employees at the San Ian Pass that run 24/7. And so the idea is to actually use the rural electrification money to connect them to the grid rather than having to run the generators. Another program kind of like that is one by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where they provide grants and loans for small rural small businesses to improve the energy efficiency of their operations. Nowhere in that language is diesel mentioned, but we're finding ways that we can actually get people into that money for instance, replacing diesel irrigation pumps with electric pumps instead. So we try to look wherever we can, for whatever kinds of public resources might be available. Yes, and then I'll get you next.
So Oregon's fairly unique in that we have weight mileage tax for our commercial vehicles, and I wanted to ask if you thought there was any way to kind of use this as a cudgel to inspire participation in cleaner fuel technologies. Can you give companies that use cleaner diesel a discount on the weight mileage tax, or vice versa?
There you go. So write your legislator today. The problem with that is that there's also a constitutional provision in Oregon that any funds assessed against the operation of a vehicle has to go into the highway fund. So to the extent that you're able to get people to agree to a higher payout based on your emission level of your vehicle, then all that money would go into the highway fund, and you miss that second part of the incentive piece where the money goes back into subsidize improvements. So you just have the one aspect of the cost signal rather than the other side, which actually helps make that happen. And then you, sir. You got to push your button, I think.
I know a study along Indiana Turnpike near Chicago that showed that the effect of air pollution disappears pretty fast if you get away from the right-of-way. But I'm wondering, in this diesel case, some places in our earth, they burn very dirty diesels. I wonder if we are impacted by that, or is that insignificant? We're just concerned about what is being done in Oregon and the United States, or also we are impacted by the rest of the world.
Well, let me think so check on me, see if I've answered your question or not. So the first is that there is kind of an alley effect towards emissions from the roadway. So it's maybe somewhere like about 700 meters out from the roadway that the impact from pollution, actually from all vehicles using the roadway, drops to where it's indistinguishable from background. But then you start looking at a map and figure out where people are, that they're not 700 meters from a roadway. And I would suggest that actually, even though we talk about rural areas, for instance in Oregon, being less impacted by diesel generally on a modeling basis, the fact is that diesel engines are used wherever people are. So you could be on a logging deck in the middle of the Willamette National Forest, but all the engines around you are diesel powered, and you can create that kind of urban type concentrations even in those kinds of urban settings. So yes, along highways is actually a good place for us to be exposed to diesel, and in fact I think California did a study that suggested that of the it's something like 6% of your day is spent commuting or something like that. But your exposure to diesel is accumulated up to a value of 60% of your diesel exposure is accumulated within that 6% of your time. I think the numbers are maybe not precise, but it's something like that. So that we tend to be around them because they are so darn useful. Does that? And then I think you were asking too about global impacts as well. So one of the aspects about diesel, and actually one of the attractions in terms of a climate change strategy as well, is that the residence time for the black carbon is actually relatively short. Some say just maybe days, but it could be weeks for that, as opposed to the carbon dioxide, which is actually a relatively long-lived pollutant, maybe 75 to 100 years. So the CO2 that's emitted by our cars as we came to this event today, that's out there for a long time, which means that if we were to stop emitting CO2 tomorrow, the value that we'd see from that reduction today would not be realized for a much longer time out in the future. But the moment that we stop emitting black carbon, we see that reduction accumulate on a much shorter time frame. There's also one of the black carbon impacts for climate change, frankly, too, is the transport onto snow. And in the Arctic, there's theorists, they're talking about accelerated melting of the Arctic ice may be coming from black carbon that comes from industrialized countries, which suggests that, and what I was reading recently is that while we think that may be a long ways from the Arctic, that what they're suggesting is that reduction of diesel emissions above the 40th parallel would probably still be a good strategy, even in the developed world, in terms of preventing that kind of impacts on climate change from the loss of the ice in the Arctic. And Salem is at the 45th, right? And so we're well above that demarcation.
Has there been any participation from the logging industry?
Not directly. And it's not for anything against the logging industry per se, just that you're looking at the diesel program in Oregon at this point, and so there's just a matter of my resource and time availability for being able to reach out to another sector. But if you have any connections there or any suggestions, I'd be happy to kind of follow through and see sometimes we make the magic happen. You know, we get champions that are motivated by this issue, they're willing to take something like this on and kind of work through some of the challenges in terms of adopting these kinds of strategies, and so I'm always looking for those opportunities. And there was a question over. So you're next, I think.
I was wondering if you could talk about the PAT study some more, beyond identifying and mapping that risk. If there was anything that you did specifically to alleviate impacts in those high-risk zones.
Well, actually, at this point, it's a study. It was the 19 pollutants that we identified. We were able to map them. We were able to looking at various impacts, looked at analyses in relation to environmental justice type communities as well. Identified a variety of strategies within those work groups. We had worked with a local advisory committee over the last couple of years to identify strategies to first of all identify the pollutants, map where the impacts are, and then make a judgment based on how much of a percentage reduction in pollutants that we would need to see in order to reach the Oregon benchmark for that given pollutant. And then also identified a number of strategies that, and the various strengths and weaknesses of each of those strategies, whether technical feasibility, availability, cost, public acceptance, and so on. And so that's about where it's at this point. We've been stressed in the department in terms of having resource capacity to take on the next step and that kind of work. And so that's about where it stands at this point. It's an analysis of impact as well as suggestion of some recommendations, but we have not been able yet to move beyond that at this point. And there was somebody else? Yes.
I know that in Southern California there's a program called the Clean Trucks Program, where they truck companies are given funding to get what they call clean trucks, and then they're required to put GPS devices in their vehicles for air quality modeling and other planning purposes.
Right.
And I was wondering if anything like that's a consideration for Oregon, if you've looked at that as an example at all.
Yes. It's a resource issue about having funding to support that kind of work. We actually had, I was kind of skeptical about truck scrapping originally, about whether that was going to be a reasonably effective strategy. When we first had the state money, we went out and actually found some vehicles, put it out on the street, as it were, and asked for people to bring us their old trucks that they wanted to scrap. And actually concluded that actually when I ran the numbers on that, there was actually very cost-effective use of funding. And so if we had more of that, we'd certainly try to do that, more of that again. There's actually a comparable effort with the Port of Seattle as well, Port of Seattle and Tacoma, where they'll pay $6,000 for people with trucks older than 94 to just scrap them. And people seem to be willing to do it. At that age of truck, that amount of money, they're willing to turn them in, and then presumably they'll go out and buy a newer truck. Maybe not a brand new truck, but a newer truck, and that's still sort of an incremental movement going forward. So that's, if we had the resources, yes, I'd be willing to take a look at that kind of work too.
So, some questions also from the web. You mentioned a little bit about diesel and they are more effective in terms of energy. So one of the questions is if there is a move towards more diesel or passenger vehicles to like standard emission like 40 miles per gallon. In Europe they use much more diesel. What would be the pros and cons of that kind of movement from conventional to more diesel?
Well, there's actually, well, we'd probably, well, let's see, what will we see? Well, likely we would see probably an increase in particulate emissions, but not, I suspect, very significant, because with the 2007 light-duty vehicles as well, they are also operating with high-efficiency pollution control devices on the tailpipe. And what I'm thinking of is a study that was done in Sweden that was compared the relative toxicity of gasoline versus diesel engines. These are European cars. It showed it over time, so that initially the diesel was, for all the range of toxics that come out of the tailpipe, the diesel was more toxic than gasoline. But then when you went to the latest stage, and the Europeans have had particle filters on their cars certainly sooner than we have had, that when you had a diesel car with a particle filter on it, that its relative toxicity was much, much less than from a comparably highly controlled gasoline engine as well. So that I think that despite my talking about the dangers of diesel, that the technology advances in diesel engines would suggest that that's actually still a reasonable strategy going forward on a new vehicle basis.
One last question.
I'm just curious, knowing all the health issues related with diesel fuel, why the government doesn't regulate companies who have vehicles without the new filter? $9,000 doesn't seem a lot of money for some huge companies.
Right. Well, I think it's probably a question of political will. So we don't have that, I think, is fairly fair to say, in this state. That other states, are various strategies that they've implemented along the way. Washington State has had a much more robust grant program. They've been able to spend, well, I've had $1 million in state money to spend. They've had something like, maybe $35 million or so over the last several years to spend. In terms of regulatory efforts towards doing that, some other states have been more aggressive that way, California being the most notable one. You might have, I think that Peter talked about that, but there's now a standard in California that if you operate a truck into California, so you could be in Idaho or Oregon for that matter, you pierce the state boundary, they expect that truck to be fitted with the best available technology, which is a particle filter at this point. And so that's, they've paid a big price politically for that kind of standard, and so we just not have seen the muster for that here yet in Oregon.
So with that, perhaps we could have ended on a more optimistic note, but you are doing great work. So thank you very much for coming today.
All right, thank you.